Questions are important. The questions we ask ourselves, I think, are important. Imagine if you woke up every day and asked yourself, what can I be grateful for today? That's a question. And also imagine if on some of those days you woke up and asked yourself, what can I be angry about today? Are those questions going to lead to different approaches to your day?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Questions matter. Answers can matter too. The first, you go into a hotel and you see sometimes it'll say, missing something you need. And then what will it say?
Please ask.
Please ask, right? And we'll fill that, find a way to fill that need. The first time I went to Haiti, there was a sign, a favorite sign I've ever seen. It was in the dining room in one of the places we were staying. It said, missing something you need. And you're expecting it to say, please let us know. It said, please let us know. We'll let you show you how you can do without it. So answers also are important, but the questions that we start with can get us to different places. My colleagues and I talked about this text in a meeting we had this week, and one of my colleagues just gets a big kick out of this gospel story we just heard, because just think for a moment if you had 5 minutes with Jesus, and you could ask Jesus anything you wanted, right? So this young man comes to Jesus. He's got Jesus' attention. He can ask him anything he wants. And what's his question? Can you make my brother give me part of the inheritance? That's the thing he wants Jesus to do. And Jesus says, listen, I'm not a probate judge. And then goes on to tell a parable. Now, as questions go, this is his question. Help me get more of the family or some of the family inheritance. And this story can be instructive for us. First of all, we know that this is not a story about basic human survival. He has food, he has clothing, he has shelter, he has all the things you need. And we know this because in the first century, if he's getting an inheritance, he comes from a family probably of means. He's not a day laborer hanging around the marketplace hoping a vineyard owner will come and put him to work so he can get a day's wage to feed his family. He's not sitting out on the lake all day fishing, hoping to catch some fish to sell at the marketplace so he can feed his family. No, he's got enough time to follow Jesus around and see if Jesus can convince his brother to give him some of the inheritance. So this is not a question of need and survival. This is a question of him wanting more than enough, wanting some abundance of possessions. And we know that is true because when Jesus looks at him, the first thing he does is say, watch out for greed. Life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And then he tells them a parable. And I really think this story gets after the question of what is human thriving. Surviving is one thing, but what does it mean to thrive? And if we ask that question as we come to this parable, Jesus starts to talk about this rich man who has enough to survive. He's got plenty. But he has a great, huge crop, and then has this conversation with his own soul. So he clearly thinks that his thriving is going to come in building even bigger barns so he can pile his stuff up so that he can do 4 things. What were those 4 things?
Eat, drink, be merry.
Eat, drink, be merry, but rest was the first one. So he's got it in his mind that now that he's got this big crop, he can pile it up so he can finally rest from his work. Eat, drink, and be merry. Now, because Jesus tells this story the way he does, it opens up the question for us. Is eating, drinking, and being merry the same thing as human thriving? And I would argue that the answer to that is no. But first I want to share a couple of stories. These are true stories. A few years back, I had a conversation with a young man who extremely gifted, very dynamic and engaging. Lots of friends. He had 2 or 3 generally part-time jobs to make ends meet. What he had studied in college, he was not able to get a job in that field. And that was true for most of his friends. And as they were approaching 30, quite a few of his friends still lived with their parents because that's what they had to do given their job situations. Now, he had everything you need. He had shelter, he had clothing, plenty of food, plenty of water, all of the needs. But as we started to talk about the future, he turned the conversation toward marriage. And said, I'm not really dating right now, but someday I hope to be married. He said, I can't go there yet, though, because I have nothing to offer. Now, as a human being, he had plenty to offer. right? If you were to ask his friends, ask his boss, his coworkers, his neighbors, his family, they would all tell you that he had plenty to offer. But what he meant was, I don't have an abundance of possessions. He wouldn't say it that way. He would say, I don't have a full-time job with really good benefits and a house and no debt and a nice car and all the rest of it. And he did not see himself as good material for a life partner unless he had all of that. Now, that's not the only time I've had that conversation. And one of my colleagues has experienced that there's a segment of our population that really has started to see marriage as more of a financial arrangement than a lifetime partnership kind of thing. Because of that same kind of question, do I have an abundance of stuff that I can bring into this relationship? Second story. Spent some time in conversation with a gentleman who had spent a life being successful in the business world, working for a huge company, working his way up to the point where he was an executive, abundance of possessions for sure, eating, drinking, being merry were definitely part of the equation, resting not so much, but had all of the stuff, anything you could imagine, he could afford it. Cancer really doesn't care about that, and when cancer eventually came, it came quickly. And when I last visited him, he was in a hospital room, not hooked up to anything because there was nothing else to do. His children were not there. His coworkers were not there. His accountant didn't show up. His financial advisor did not show up. And the stuff was not there to hold his hand as he was dying all alone. The abundance of possessions is not the path to human thriving, Jesus seems to be telling us in this parable. And these two stories are kind of at the bookends of adulthood. One getting started that doesn't see any value in himself unless he has an abundance of stuff, and one who has had the abundance of stuff but ends up dying alone because the relationships that we need for human thriving weren't there. Now these may seem like extreme stories, though they are very true. We probably live much of our lives in the middle of all of that, trusting in an abundance of stuff probably more than we would like to admit. I've had conversations with people who have said, well, when we get the new house, things will be better because we'll have more room. If we just can get the new car and not have to be dealing with the maintenance all the time, then things will be better. Now, there are times, like if you don't have enough and if survival is a thing, that having enough would be better. But when we live in that space of thinking that the stuff is the path to human thriving, we neglect some of the other bits of pieces of life that really are necessary in those relationships that are around us. And we are encouraged to do this all the time. Almost every billboard you see is an invitation into believing that something is going to make your life better if you could just have it. If you're retired and you've ever seen a drug commercial on TV, it is like the perfect retirement picture. Right? There's a meadow and a lake. Some of them have a bathtub in the meadow, by the lake. And all this said, if you just had all this stuff, then you would be thriving. But that's not the way this works. We have been conditioned by our culture to believe that capitalism is the path to human thriving. And you can't really argue that in our culture, that capitalism is it. It's the greatest economic system ever devised. If we just get it right, then we will all be whole and happy. We can rest, eat, drink, and be married. It'll all be there. If that was true, a couple hundred years into this capitalism thing, we probably would have figured it out. I was curious this week, so I went and looked up the free and reduced lunch statistics for Orange County. Free and reduced lunch is based on your income level. So the poverty level is somewhere around like $25,000 for a family of 4. If you can imagine trying to live in this metropolitan area where housing is super expensive on $25,000 for 4 people, just housing and utilities and all that is going to eat up a huge chunk of that, right? And so if you make up to like 130% of that, which still is a lot of money, you can apply for free and reduced lunch. In the 04-05 school year in Orange County, 49-something% of our kids were eligible for free and reduced lunch. In 2016, so the 15-16 school year, that number had gone up to 64.9%. That means that 2/3 of the kids in this county probably don't have enough to eat every day. So capitalism is not even giving us human surviving, let alone human thriving. Now there's more that can be learned from this story. As Jesus tells this parable, the rich man who has piled up all the stuff and is now finally thinking he's going to get to rest, God comes to him and says, this very night your life will be demanded of you. Who is demanding his life? In the story, who does it sound like? I always thought it was God, because God's the one talking to him. God says, hey, you got all this stuff, whose is it going to be? Your life is being demanded of you. This is where grammar gets interesting. In Greek, the who will demand your life of you, that verb is in the third person plural. And in the story, there's one God and one rich man. The only thing that is in the plural is the possessions. So when God says, this very night, your life will be demanded of you, what Jesus seems to be saying is that your possessions today are already eating up your life. All of this stuff you have dedicated your time and your energy to taking care of your stuff. Now, we're not talking about just having the basics, right? We're talking about an abundance of possessions. And if you really think about it, the more stuff you have, the more time and energy it takes to take care of it. If you have one room to clean, how long does that take? If you have 10 rooms, that takes more. And the more rooms you have, the more insurance you have to get. And the more you have to be worried that people are going to take your stuff. And all of a sudden, much of your energy and time is spent taking care of your possessions. So what Jesus seems to be saying through this parable is the stuff is going to eat you up. That's not the most important thing. But what I really love about this parable is the way that Jesus answers the young man. In my mind, the young man has a bottom-up view of this situation. There's an inheritance that he is getting nothing of, right? It's supposed to roll downhill from generation to generation. Jesus does not tell him a parable about someone on the bottom side of that story, but on the top side. He tells the parable about the rich man who accumulated all the stuff. So if you take Jesus' story and sit it over the top of the young man, it's not hard to imagine that the young man's father is the rich man. I've accumulated all of these things, right? And then in the parable it says, who's going to get them? Well, who's going to get them but the heirs? Now, what does the young man in this story inherit? He says, make my brother share with me. So what did he inherit?
Well, half.
Well, probably nothing, right? He's saying, make my brother divide it. But that's not really true, because he didn't inherit something. He inherited a dispute with his brother. You think you're leaving a bunch of stuff for your family, but really you're giving them a fight. And I know enough estate attorneys that I've had conversations with that that's not unusual. Some families do okay. But he inherits a fight with his brother. And what does his brother inherit? Well, he gets all the stuff, but he also inherits a fight with his brother. Together they inherit a broken relationship. And if you look around our world, wherever there's abundance of stuff, there is often, to go with it, broken relationships. Why did we fight the Revolutionary War? Taxes, because we wanted our stuff, right? Why did we fight the Civil War? Slavery, which was an economic system that made sure some people didn't have enough and others had plenty, right? Don't mess with our stuff, right? The abundance of possessions like this can so often lead to brokenness in human relationship, because what sits underneath it is a question. Questions are important. And the question that drives so much of who we are as human beings a lot of the time is, what's in it for me? The young man is saying, what's in it for me? The old man isn't really asking the question. He's deciding what's in it for him, and it's eating, drinking, being merry, and resting. But he's never really going to get to rest. And when we ask what's in it for me, sometimes that seems to be about possessions, but it also, what sits underneath it, I think, is about our space in the world and the power that we have. And that's where the violence comes in. When we have land or oil or economics, when someone says, what's in it for me and what's going to give me power and maintain my place in the world, now we start to fight. And this is where I think we end up with a lot of the violence that we have seen, especially this weekend. So often, the people that do these shootings are white, single men. And they, I think, are asking the question, what's in it for me? And they have been told that the immigrants are going to take your jobs and the black people are going to displace you as the person of power. And they feel like something is being taken away from them that they don't want taken away from them. And whether it's the economics of it or the power of it, somewhere in there, there's not really a question of the basic needs of humanity. It's a question, perhaps, of thriving. And when they come to the conclusion that someone is taking something that belongs to them, then they want to fight. And they want to lash out and be violent. Because they are not thriving as human beings, and they are missing something. What they have not inherited is those whole and healthy relationships. I don't think this is about mental illness. Certainly sometimes that might be a factor, but more often I think this is an ideology. And people get caught up in a question of what belongs to me and what I am due. And if I don't get what I'm due, then somebody else is going to have to pay for that because I'm going to fight for it. Jesus says, piling up stuff, which is also piling up power, right, is not the path to human thriving, but being rich toward God is. Can we be rich toward God? We can try. Martin Luther, in the explanation of the third article of the Creed, says that we cannot come to know and love God all by ourselves. Right? We can't do that. Is God rich toward us? Absolutely. If you think about Jesus, right, the questions that drive Jesus, Jesus did not wake up every day and think, what's in it for me? Had Jesus asked what's in it for me, the answer he would have got is scheming and lying against you, getting arrested in the dark of night, getting beaten and tortured and hung on a cross. If he asks what's in it for me, that's what he's going to get. But that's not the question he asked. He asked, what am I here to do for you? And because he asked, what am I here to do, what he was here to do was to go through all of that death, but bring life out the other side. And in doing that, then he gives us a gift of freedom. We don't have to ask, what's in it for me? What's in it for us is God's grace. What's in it for us is a gift of life. What's in it for us is not worrying about just the basic needs of survival, but living in the thriving of human relationship that Jesus has gifted us with. Because his death makes us right with God, and resurrection life gives us an opportunity to live right with one another. We then can ask a different question. Freed from wondering what's there for us, we can ask the same kind of question Jesus did, what can I do for somebody else? This is what I love about hanging out with people from Haiti. I got to do that for a couple of days this week with this guy, a friend of mine named Verbeau. He is a community organizer, and he is a very educated person who could have left Haiti a long time ago if he wanted to. But he chose to stay in a village on a mountain with 23,000 people, 0 doctors, and no potable water. And about a decade ago, a little bit more, he looked around and said, we don't have a school. And so we asked for some space to start a school, and they had a kindergarten. Well, then the next year they had to have first grade and kindergarten. So now they are all the way up through 8th grade. Now this is the thing. You're on the side of the mountain where what we would consider they don't have any resources. But he believes they have everything they need. And so as this school has grown, often what happens is Americans with an abundance of possessions will come and say, what do you need? How can we help? And just want to give them the resources. He says no to offers like that. If you just gave him money to fund his teachers, and then you got tired of giving him money, how's he going to pay his teachers? He's not, right? If you show up and build him something, and then leave and it breaks, who's going to fix it? So his whole view of the world is we have all of these resources, and yes, if you want to come help, great, but you're going to be in a relationship with us. So you can have all the basics, but the human thriving comes in those relationships. And so they have this school, you have to pay to go to the school, like $60 a year. And some of the families can, but some of them can't. Well, if they can't, they give them a goat. And say, when this goat has babies, give us a goat back. When this goat is a source of commerce, use that to take care of your family, and then just give us a little bit back. And then they find out who in the community has skills that they can use. They see that as resources. We're going to build this thing, we'll build it ourselves. If you have materials, bring the materials. If you're a mason, bring your talent. At one point, Verbeau said, an idea is a resource that can be taken advantage of. Just an idea. So if you have an idea, bring that. And then as we people, if we can say, well, what can I do to help, right? Instead of of what's in it for me, what's going to make me feel good if I come help you, what do you need and how can I help? He would say, well, come walk alongside us. They have a cistern that someone helped them build. Helped them build, right? Didn't build it for them, walked alongside, and now they can't drink the water. So their next step is to find someone that can help build that system that makes it drinkable, but not do it for them and disappear. Walk alongside in relationship so that this can be sustainable. His school now has 195 kids in it. In this little mountainside thing where there's no water that you can drink and there is no doctor, they have 195 kids that are in school every day because the community has come together to live in that space. Now, I would argue that they don't even have enough of the stuff we need to survive every day. It's an extremely poor place, but they have found a space of some kind of human thriving in that coming together as community. And this, I think, is what we can learn. That for all of the abundance of possessions that our culture surrounds us with every day, it is that invitation into human community that is where we will find our thriving. We asked Verbo a couple of questions. One of them, there's a Haitian proverb, and I'm going to get this horribly wrong, but it goes something like, God created all this stuff, but it's our job to distribute it. Not to hoard it, right? It's our job to distribute it. But the other question that I found was telling is we were talking about some of the same stories that I shared with you, right? About the guy dying alone. And somebody looked at Verbo and said, have you ever seen a Haitian die alone? And he said, well, in an accident. And he said, no. Like a long illness where there's, and he said, well, no, never. People are always dead. Right? It's that gift of community. So surrounded by a county of 2/3 of children who probably don't have enough to eat, and not too far away from a country that lives in great poverty. Today's story is one that invites us into human relationship in a different kind of way, to see the path to human thriving not in the abundance of stuff, but in the abundance of grace that we can share with one another, the abundance of love we can share with one another. And a lot of that starts with a question. That's not what is in this for me, but what has God gifted me with to share with you? And how can we carry that into the world in relationship together so that God's grace can thrive among us? Amen.